Hello, welcome, and thank you for coming to our session. I do want to encourage anyone there in the back rows and in the sides to come a little bit together. It would be wonderful to have you a little more in community if you can. Before I turn it over to our moderator and panelists, because that's why you're all here, of course, I am Nicole Garzino. I'm a team member at NCG, and I just wanted to do a little housekeeping and a little info to kick you off. You should have all received 2 white cards. After we hear a little bit from our panelists, we're going to give you a chance to speak to your neighbors and to engage with each other and to ask us questions. So we're going to use these cards. One, you'll see Willa will invite you to think of big, bold ideas. So one of those will be for big, bold ideas that spark in your minds and hearts when you listen to our panelists. And the other's for Q&A. Just for ease and simplicity during this, we are going to gather up your questions and bring them to the panelists. So please take 2 cards. If you need one, go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, great. And that's why I'm also encouraging you, if you can, to squeeze a little bit together, or at least be near a friend or colleague, because we will have about 5 or 10 minutes to do a speak to your neighbor, share ideas with your neighbor, share the big, bold ideas and thoughts for your Q&A together. So we'd love for you to be physically in proximity to someone if you can. Okay, well that's wonderful. You're not here to hear me talk. You're here to hear our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to let Willa Selden from Bridgespan, our moderator, take over. Welcome, come on out.
Good morning. It's great to be with you. So last year I took a class called Soul Gardening. And this soul gardening class began with the notion of starting out to say, what do we need to do in our lives? What do we have in our lives that needs composting? What beliefs, what practices, what behaviors, what past experiences need to be composted? And as you know, composting is kind of smelly and it's kind of messy stuff. So as we think about what needs to happen in philanthropy, we also need to consider, what do we need to compost? How do we think about what we've been learning and what we need to learn to understand what we need to let go of? There's some things we already know about that we need to let go of. We need to let go of not engaging community and not having community lead when we need to make decisions and choices that are about community. We know that we also need to let go of thinking that we basically see our grantees as the folks that are there to fulfill our theory of change. This practice of composting also creates the opportunity for us to see and to imagine what's possible, to do some seed planting that will allow the kind of liberation and equality and equity that we want to see happen in the world. And so both things are necessary. And the soil that we know comes from spending that time doing the composting creates that fertile ground for the seeds that we plant, for the efforts that we engage in to really flourish and create the garden that then we all can thrive in based upon the water and the nutrients we need to be successful. So today we're going to spend time talking about what does need to be composted, and also spending some time talking about what does the future look like. If we look out far into the future, if we look out also into the near future, what do we imagine is needed, and what do we imagine is possible? So that's the space we're going to be spending a lot of time in today. And we know that when we do composting, it requires also personal work. That's what you heard in this last panel, the kind of personal work that's needed to do this work. And so we want to hear from our panelists as well. What is it that they've had to also go through in their lives? What have they had to learn? What have they had to unlearn to do this work? So I couldn't be more excited for this particular panel. We have Glenn Galich. Glenn is the CEO of the Stepsky Foundation. And when I talked to Glenn, I was really impressed with the ideas that he mentioned about the work that they've been doing at Stepsky And I've known the Stupski Foundation for years, so it's no small thing that this change has happened at the Stupski Foundation, and the kinds of changes that they're making with regards to equity, with regards to the way that they're engaging, collaborating with others. And so I know you're going to be very excited to hear Glenn's personal story of how he got there, given he's someone that's been in philanthropy for a long time, as well as the kind of work that he's participating in, but also seeing others do. I'm also really excited to have Jacqueline here as well. And Jacqueline is an amazing leader. She is a social advocate at heart. That's who she is. And so Jacqueline leads the Latino Community Foundation, has done an extraordinary job there. I remember when you first arrived, and she brought her incredible energy, but also her brilliance to that work, and continues to be a strong advocate for what needs to happen for people in communities and for people that are dealing with issues of equity in their lives. And she's doing that every day in the work that she's doing. So she has a lot to share with you as well. And then I'm really privileged to also introduce Janice, who is leading this Tides Foundation, Tides Network. And Janice came into Tides a few years ago in a very tough time in the organization and has really just made extraordinary change happen. She's someone that is both strategic and courageous in how she shows up in her work and in her life, and is really moving Tides to be an organization that is about power and is about looking also at the kinds of systems change we need in order to get to a place that really works again for all people to be successful. So really excited to be here as well with Janice. So this is our group, and Nicole mentioned that if you want the details of everyone, please look at the information that that NCG provided, and we'll take it from there. Thanks so much. So we're going to jump right in, and we'll start with you, Glenn. So basically, Glenn, let's start right into the heart of it, which is, as you think about what needs to happen in the future, I'll just mention, I was with one of my clients yesterday, and he's looking at 2045 and saying, we're going to be a majority diverse country by then. And if we don't make the changes that we need, by 2045, we're going to be in trouble. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear a couple of ideas that you have for what we're going to do around shifting power and philanthropy.
Thank you. And thank you all for deciding to spend your time here. I know you have lots of options today as to where you want to spend your time, so I feel no pressure to deliver. Do you feel? I like this question because I try to think about where we've been to get to where we are, and I think about it within the lens of the foundation sector. And I don't know, I imagine many of you work at foundations. I have been at one for 7 years and have been in the sector for 20. That happened fast, actually more than 20. And I go back and I become more interested in the history of the foundation sector. And what I realized when I started to do my own research is that we are an instrument of the financial sector. Rarely do people start foundations because they want to do it for philanthropic reasons. They're doing it to protect their assets. And they're doing it to protect as much of their assets as they can. They make some sacrifice, but they're doing it to protect their assets. So it's really about holding on to power. So what I've realized as of late, and I love where we are at the moment, I think, amongst some of us in the sector and the foundation world, is we're starting to ask the question, how do you rip philanthropy out of the financial sector? What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, it means coming to grips with the power you hold in the sector, and the phrase has been used, you were just using it, Willa, learning how to let go of control. Because that's what we do in foundations. We control things. And so in our little shop, we started thinking a couple years ago, kind of living a mantra to some degree, which is really all I have to add about the future. I would hope that more of us in the foundation sector would consider this mantra. Why is it more important for us at Stupski to hold on to these assets and to make sure they're in the hands of the people actually doing the work in community and in organizations that represent them? What are we doing? that's so much better than them? Why would they allow us to keep hoarding away like we are? And the effect of that was really quite powerful internally. We had intended last year to move about $35 million, which would have kept us on pace for the spend down that we have committed to. We started talking about this mantra a little bit, and in 6 months, we had moved double the amount that we had before. And I'll just wrap up by saying the reason that happened was because program officers internally who had been making big plans, big theories of change, big logic models, convenings, networks they were going to build, all said, why would I take the time and money to do that? We'll just move it. And one in particular, who works in our Hawaiian team, she moved $15 million, just like that. Turns out, actually moving power is a lot easier than we want it to be in our head. So those are some things we think about at Stepsky.
Have you go next, Janice.
She's going to have the new person on the block go first, so thank you for that. As Willa was mentioning, I've been at Tides now a couple of years, just joined, and I now say I'm entering my junior year. So if you all remember what it was like to be a freshman, and my freshman year was 2021, and then last year being a sophomore. So not that there's complete clarity now, but I'm definitely a little bit more confident in that regards. But when I think about philanthropy and the future of philanthropy, I think it's important that we're even having this conversation when we talk about power and philanthropy in the same sentence. And a lot of surprises. I mean, I don't pride myself on being a philanthropist per se, but I do consider myself to be a social impact leader. And so there were definitely some experiences I stepped into, but one of the things that we've had many great experiences with Bridgespan and Willa, but how do we democratize philanthropy? And so I remember even going through my interview journey at Tides and having conversations with our board about where Tides is on its journey and how excited the board was, and this was in 2020, of all years to be excited about much of anything. But the fact that there was unprecedented growth that Tides was realizing, and the board was excited about that. Well, the rationale or the reason for that unprecedented growth wasn't necessarily positive, at least from my point of view. So the fact that there were communities that were suffering from the pandemic, many communities that look like me, the fact that George Floyd's killing took place that summer, there definitely were folks who were responding with pretty lofty checks in regards to contributions to Tides. And while that is a good thing, the rationale, what has got us there in terms of systems, was not. And so I remember being very clear with our board that if you're looking for someone or a leader to come in and just move money, I'm not the person for you. My commitment is, how are we going to move things faster in terms of real system change? And I think I just saw Peter sit down. So unlike some of our colleagues or my colleagues, we don't have an endowment at Tides, but we're in a unique position to work with donors and doers. And so our next chapter is, how do we really shift power, which means uncomfortable conversations with donors about where that money comes from and where those resources should be directed. And then as important is, how do we strengthen the power of proximate leaders on the ground who are really driving change? And how fast can we make that happen? So we have an initiative, and I say to Peter, called Get Off Your Assets. Goya, right? And so Peter knows it's one of my favorite things under his leadership is, how are we going to use our superpowers to get our partners to get off their assets so we can make change happen much faster? So I really see the future of philanthropy not be locked in this box. And as I speak to even philanthropy, it's a business model. What we really should be caring about are the issues on the other side that we're trying to solve.
I think everything's been said already. Thank you. Thank you both. With Glenn's statement of, imagine if we're all trying to work ourselves out of a job, then we've actually done what we said we came here to do, which is redistribute wealth. Philanthropy not only is about control of the purse, it's a control about ideas and narratives and who we get to choose to elevate. And one of the things that I hope will happen, and to your point, Janice, between, I think it was June of 2020 and January 2021, foundations gave $12 billion in response to the crises. There was a fast move of putting money out. I love what was said this morning about this marathon of sprints. The hard part is that these sprints end too quickly. And so when I think about Glenn's model of thinking of this trajectory of just moving the money into the hands of the people that have been working in and out of crises and giving them the power to determine their future, that is ultimately what we want to see happen in philanthropy. When I think about, and I'm coming back to your original question right now, is that world that we envision, controlling assets, moving it to the control of community, being in partnership with them so that the power shift is, because it's more about, it's not just about money, it is about ideas and narrative. And I think about what happened in the 1960s when Ford Foundation came in and basically told Cesar Chavez, organizing is great, why don't you organize them for education? Let's start building programs that will help farm workers. And in the need to keep the lights on, we moved a movement of organizing farm workers for their human rights to figuring out how we place educational programs to help them survive in the poverty that they were living in. So foundations control the narrative by saying, well, this is what's going to work. We'll set our priority, we'll set our logic model, we'll set the goals and the success, this is what it would look like. And then we're going to get community to align with this. So yes, it's about giving the power, the money to people, but it's also about letting them determine what those success looks like, what that vision looks like, what they say they need in order to get there. And I feel like I'm all over the place. I'm thinking about what Glenn is saying. I'm trying to tie it to what Janice is saying. At the Latino Community Foundation, we didn't have an endowment. Now, I've been on this quest, many of you know, to build this power fund that is about moving money, core support dollars to Latino-led grassroots organizations, let them dream up their future, just back them up with the resources, create the platforms and spaces for them to speak up and move public dollars to their communities. But it's also been about building an institution that will be around beyond the crisis moments, right? So the idea of the endowment for us wasn't to sit on our assets. It was to really align all of the money to the entrepreneurs, to the wealth creation ideas that come from community and aligning it with them, right? I'm going to stop there because I feel like I have so much to say. And part of what I'm trying to come back to, and I had my talking points right now, but Glenn just like ignited something right now because the control of assets, but it's the control of narrative, the control of ideas, the control of what the future should look like that sits too heavily on the foundation side.
So you can see why I'm so excited for this conversation. So in this topic, there's no complete answer, as you heard from the other panel if you were there. We don't know what this should look like. I don't necessarily personally know what 2045 or 2550 will look like. So we're going to be in the space of imagination in this conversation. So I'm going to push on you a bit, Glenn, which is that, okay, so let's imagine that basically people did what you are doing, which is basically spin through. What then happens? Like, how then do we get to, because, we've seen just with what's happened with cannabis. We had a number of people of color entrepreneurs that was partly how they made a living. And you would expect that maybe with this becoming legal, some of them could become wealthy and successful in that. But actually, because those folks may not necessarily have the resources, the skill, the investment, the networks, that hasn't really taken place. So part of what worries me about your vision is what replaces this opportunity when philanthropy is being done well and effectively? What's next if we go to a sense that basically all of that is spent and we're now into a different environment? And you may have thought through these things, and if so, I would love to hear like how you think about that. Sorry to ask you such a hard question. It's
really unfair. Because, well, let's say this. Oftentimes when I talk about spend down, the response, especially from my closest peers, by the way, who work in the justice community, they're very concerned that if all the justice funders spent down, what would be left is the status quo to fund. And I always say, can you imagine a world where $800 billion suddenly dumped into racial justice in about 5 years? I would think that would be pretty great. and then whatever's left over, I'm ready for the fight. But the fact of the matter is, I don't expect this economic system to change anytime soon, and more people of wealth will be sheltering dollars in foundations, and we will continue. What does it look like, though, if more foundations jumped in, moved more of their assets, and I think that's the only role that a foundation need have, in a way, is to make sure the resources are returned to people who have lived in very deprived conditions. And by that, I don't mean necessarily the same as marginalized. I mean definitely marginalized communities, but communities that have been seeking assets and capital to build and would now have it. I mean, a big part of philanthropy, from what I can tell, at least as we've been thinking more about it, well, I'll say it this way. When we first decided to get we were a spend down and have been one since 2019. We became very aggressive about it. We originally had intended to move most of our grant making dollars by 2029. We are on track now. I don't know if this will happen. This is what our projections show, that will likely be done by early 2025 of our grant making assets because of the pace at which the team is moving. When we originally started thinking about that, I met with what would be a future board member. She was a peer funder at the time, and she said, well, what are you going to ask grantees what they need? How are you going to determine how much to move to them? And I said, well, I'll just ask them what they need. And she said, you realize you're asking a question of a person or an organization that has been wildly deprived by the foundation sector, so they're likely going to give you a very deprived response. So I would encourage you to ask them, what do they want to do for the next 10 years, and fund that. Yeah. And so, you know, Willa, that's a great question. I don't really think it's up to the foundation sector to figure out, to have a vision for that future necessarily. I think the foundation sector needs to spend a hell of a lot more time thinking about giving up what it has and start moving the resources, because the visions are all over the place. It's not like I need to figure it out. Please don't let me figure it out. And so it's that, to me, is I know I'm shortchanging the question, but I think we have so much work in the foundation sector to just peel off the controls we put on ourselves and the people around us. And by the way, when you get rid of all that bullshit, it's a hell of a lot more fun to be at a foundation. I will tell you. I will tell you for sure. So that's just where I think I'm more in the present these days than I am in the future, and therefore I'm going to come up short on the question.
No, I thought your answer was great, because this is about, we are in a space where we need to, there's not one single answer, right? And we do need to kind of get more money out faster to the people that really need it, and that also have a vision for it. Right. So I love this question of like asking about the want and the vision as opposed to the need. And Jacqueline, I have a feeling you wanted to say something.
Well, I'm thinking about your question, and I'm thinking, what do endowments provide? They provide security. And in the case of foundations, they provide security and control for a group of folks who have hoarded wealth. What if we shifted and not only supported the people and their vision and just move that money forward, but also rethink how we think about the 10-year arc that was just talked about earlier? What about seeding endowments for movement builders and movement leaders? What about helping grassroots nonprofits buy their buildings so that when the next wave of uprooting in their communities happen, they don't move? They can't move because they own where they're at. And I'm saying that very sensitive to land ownership, right? Because I'm also thinking, for us right now with our economic justice work, is how do we get farm workers to not just work the land, but own the land in cooperation with one another and with the land, right? So why can't we build endowments for those things that will take generations to bring about? But when we think about the investments of those endowments, learning a lot here. How do we also invest it in those wealth creation opportunities that are generational, that will open up opportunities for young people to dream of a career in art or career in the creative arts? There's so many opportunities where we can use all sides of the equation and invest in the people who have been deprived, but not just in the here and now, but in the long term of investing in that future and letting them determine how they want to use it.
Yeah, I was going to comment and say, to me, that's the evidence of shifting and strengthening power, right? And this is where I think endowments are powerful, is if we think about where those investments are placed, right? So in our case, where we don't necessarily have an endowment, we are having the conversation about racially centered impact investing, right? And not just racial lens, but racially centered impact investing. And how do we, over time, move all of our assets in alignment with that? So when I think of your comment about wealth creation, to me, this is a good opportunity and example of shifting that privileged, power that we started with into something that has real system change on the other side in terms of, say, especially Black and brown communities.
And important to say that not just an economic recovery, but an economic renaissance. Like when I think about wealth creation, and folks have heard me say this, we talk about having the largest network of Latino philanthropists. I don't want Latinos to be the same types of philanthropists that we have seen in the past, right? When we talk about democratizing philanthropy, it's not about repeating the cycle and just adding a new face to it. It's leading from the values that we know are important to our communities, the us version of it, and leading with that. Not just setting that aside because we need to fit into a box of how things were done. So when I think about wealth creation, I don't like the idea of reform. Sometimes you just got to rebuild, rebuild it from scratch and start fresh and anew. And that does take time and it takes risk. And I think that that's where philanthropy has a role to play a little longer, in just giving the money and letting people just take risk. And this morning, Mia said it, we need room to fail. We need room just to get out there, try things, do things, and fail, and then back up again and keep doing it. We've done it without the resources. It'd be great to do it with them.
So in this context of pretty radical change that you started us out with, Glenn, which is great because it really gets into the right conversation of what needs to happen around power shifting, around resources, community organizations and leaders being truly resourced to do what they need in order to be successful and resourced over time. So how do we create this notion of anchor institutions that are led by BIPOC folks and that are dealing with what needs to happen in community and have them be funded over years to come? So Janice, I know this is a topic you've thought a lot about, like how do we think about what needs to happen around power, around the systems change pieces. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your vision for that.
Yeah, one of the things that when I think about the moment we're in and what are some of those game-changing plays, I'm hearing collaboration more than ever before. I mean, we've been talking about partnership and all of that, say, for decades, but I was thinking about Crystal's comments in the earlier session, and then also you're mentioning as well about shared risk. Is I think one of the opportunities is for us as donors or as partners to share that risk. And so, one of the opportunities that we Ties approached not too long after I came on board was to join the Democracy Frontlines Fund. Here's an incredibly powerful fund that's been created and led by Libra Foundation and Crystal with strong support from everyone, right? And so why do we need to create something different when here's a fund that is well on its way? So I think one of the opportunities is for us to start sharing that risk and sharing that accountability, right? If we're really going to be serious about system change and hopefully shortening that cycle.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about collaboration because I think it's a really powerful vehicle, as you suggested, for what needs to happen in philanthropy. And in talking a few years ago with a number of leaders that were leading foundations, they talked about just the challenge of, actually moving their organizations in ways that are aligned that way, and also building different sets of skills because collaboration does require a different muscle, what you need to do. And then I want to mention also that in terms of the systems changes that we're talking about, I think philanthropy is in a place where it has to, we have to also become facile at collaborating with government and collaborating with business around some of the systems changes that need to happen. Jacqueline, I know you've thought about this question of like, how do you partner more with government? How do you look at government resources? I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, to Glenn's point, $800 billion, if we can move that towards racial equity, we'd be in a good place. And yet, we know that government holds even like more resources that have been extracted from community and not reinvested in the way that matters to community. So because we didn't have an endowment and because we didn't have a large amount of money to pull funds, we were fundraising to put money back in to our communities here in California. We realized at the moment when the Biden administration released their, $1.9 trillion and another $1.7 trillion to supposedly help communities recover that were impacted by COVID, we shifted quickly because we said, okay, we have this window, an opportunity. We talk about these transformational, transgenerational investments in that they happen once in a generation. Hopefully they'll happen more often. But our responsibility in philanthropy, and I use this word lightly because we don't have an endowment and the wedge was not that big, but we put it in there. We put it at $1.3 million, 35 organizations, and wrapped around a whole bunch of other support that they asked for in order to tap into these federal dollars. And in less than 10 to 12 months, these leaders who have not been at these tables to determine moved quickly to move $300 million back into their community. Money that was spent for mental health services, for broadband expansion, for job creation for young people. They determined what they call the people's budget for their local cities and fought for those dollars to be invested back into their community. That to us is where we also begin to shift power from the ones in government that are holding these purses. And by the way, these were in communities where the city council were predominantly white leaders that were on the far right that really didn't care to have the voices of young brown folks tell them how to spend the money. But because of writing op-eds and pushing the outside world they were living in, the voices were heard. And not only did this young group, and I'm thinking about Jalisco in the Imperial Valley, excuse me. Been traveling a lot for family reasons, but the Imperial Valley, when they decided what they wanted to support in their community, not only did they get the money, $10 million, but they also got new city council members elected that represented their values. So this was a process that wasn't just about the money, but it was about being seen, heard, recognized, and valued. And I've talked about this in different circles because I think it's so important. The money matters, but what really matters is that folks understand that they have the agency to bring about the changes that they want and that they're given the opportunity and the platforms to get it done, whether it's private or public dollars.
So you all are in a situation where you're leading your organizations. And I'm sure there's some folks out here that some of whom may be doing that and others are basically inside of organizations, some of whom may not be led by people like you, but they have the still belief and the desire to see things change. So I'm interested to just hear your thoughts about, first of all, when you're trying to move your organizations, what challenges have you had to face, or what ways have you had to kind of begin to bring your teams along, and how have you managed to do that? So maybe we'll start with that question, and let me ask anyone if you can start that answer.
Okay, I'm looking at, why are they all looking down here? Well, and I am very mindful of, say, stepping into my role as a Black woman and what did that mean to Tides in, say, 2021. And as excited as I was and am in terms of the opportunity that presents itself, I think a very interesting, humbling occurrence happened a couple of months ago during Black History Month. We had several of our we call them Tidesters, two Black women hosted a kind of a fireside chat just to talking about what it means to be a Black woman, not only at Tides, but in this space, right? This space being social impact, social justice, et cetera. And not a few, but then others chimed in on chat and said, I would never want Janice's job. And we also have several other Black women on our leadership team. So that was an affirmation where here I'm hopeful that I'm sharing light and love, right, in terms of being in this very visible space, but to hear my teammates share that I would never want her job, and whether that's because of microaggressions or the pressure that comes with this, or the fact that this work is so personal, because it's all of that, I was hopeful that I'm also creating a space where others would want to, step into this role. So I say that because there's still a lot that comes with being in this very special place, regardless of gender, race, et cetera. But I do know there's additional responsibility I have as a Black woman in this particular moment, in this particular space. And as I often say, and I shared, the work is as much personal as it is professional, right? Understanding, I grew up in Richmond, California, my parents, so I don't have to go very far, right, to share or think about the experiences of the communities that you're saying that we're serving and that we're mobilizing and that we hope are empowered by virtue of the resources that we can invest. So I'm also one too where if I don't get it done, I don't have to wait for my board to tell me. I will know, but while I'm here, and Crystal spoke to this, during the previous session as well, is I'm here to disrupt. I'm here to hopefully partner and innovate. I'm here hopefully to create change and build upon what's already good, if not great, in terms of the legacy of Tides.
So Janice, in that moment of both the challenge of kind of moving an organization that's obviously you're making pretty big, sizable shifts in how they've worked in the past and what will be in the future. You do have a board that you've got to also manage. So how do you, what are the reserves, how do you have the reserves to kind of have the momentum, keep the momentum going with what you're doing and to be continually encouraged in pushing that work forward?
That's a great question, and I don't remember that question, Willa. Well, one, I would say I do have a great board, and for those of you in executive director, CEO roles who know how important that relationship is with your board, I'm in an incredible space, very supportive board, and this year will be another dynamic year. We're going to recruit 5 new board members, so I share all of this because that board can make or break you in this role. So it is important that you have a board where there is alignment. I think one of the things that really worked well and filled my cup, Willa, was the work we did with Bridgespan. It really was a defining moment for the organization, for our board to be a part of a strategic planning process that was very comprehensive, my executive team, and all of our staff, right? This was the first time in a long time where everyone was engaged in the process. So for me, when I think about being in a space where I can not just hopefully thrive, but find peace, my relationship with the board is incredibly important. My relationship with staff. So one of the other opportunities, I do say it's an opportunity at Tides, is we're now unionized. So I stepped into a place in a space where staff had voted to unionize back 2018-ish, 2019, and thrilled with the fact that we landed the agreement with the union last year, which is huge. So we embrace that as opportunity and love as well, where when we speak to equity, this is something that's not just about myself, but every single person in the organization. And then the other piece that I think keeps me whole as well, not just in addition to board, executive team, staff, but also the spaces outside of Tides. And so I'm going to say this, my relationship with Willa started off very professional, but the fact that I have, sister friends like Willa or Crystal who really embraced me on this journey. There's a community of women who really reached out to me when I came back home. I was in Dallas, Texas for about 13 years too long before coming back to this role. And I will say, when I think about what keeps us whole, it's that community, right? When I leave Tides, but actually I don't ever leave Tides. Let me be clear, with this job, you don't leave it. But the fact that there really has been an incredible community that reached out to me to say, hey, we want to ensure that you have what you need to be successful, but also just to live, right? So the conversations with Crystal and Willa and Nicole Taylor there's a bunch of us. I saw Nwamaka going to a session. It's been very, very comforting for me on this and sometimes people say it's a lonely journey as a CEO. I've never been lonely in this role. It's never been a lonely journey, but I have had just an incredible, thought partner list, but also sister friends to ensure that I do fill my cup up from time to time.
So, Jacqueline, I'd love to have you talk a little bit about, for folks that are inside organizations that don't necessarily have what they need around support, et cetera, and that really do want to see things happen. And Glenn, you may have some thoughts about this as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Either of you can start.
So the internal team is a question. start? Okay, so I'm going to start by saying when I came to LCF, there were 4 staff members, and 2 of them were leaving because there were no resources, because the foundation was struggling to keep the lights on. The 2 women that remained there were these powerful game changers, organizers that saw the world that hadn't been created yet. And they were the ones who inspired me to say yes to this role, because I was leaving a job that was a very comfortable one, Glenn, in a foundation that had not even, just wanted to do the 5%, keep its doors open, just comfortable. And here I was stepping into this role where we barely had resources to maintain these powerhouses of women who had this vision for the Latino community here in California. Moving forward, build the whole organization based on those attributes. It wasn't about experience and foundation. It wasn't about coming from that space. It was about coming from community and people who knew how to organize. And I'm looking at Diana Otero, who comes from Catholic Charities, who is an immigrant herself, who came here organizing, not just for herself, for her family and her community, but did it for a whole number of undocumented immigrants here in California. Those were the people that we wanted to bring and build a family around internally. And there's a lot to learn, because there's all this jargon that we use in the foundation world, and sometimes it's uncomfortable to sit in spaces when you haven't come from it. But the one thing that we committed to was not to fit into those boxes and those molds, right? To not only lead from our Latinidad, and my dad is Black, mom is white, I'm an Afro-Latina, coming from New York City to the West Coast was eye-opening for me in terms of what it meant to be a Latina here in the West Coast. But when we came to the Latino Community Foundation, it was about embracing the wholeness of who we were as people, that our lived experiences mattered more on whether or not we had that job that was about writing checks or not. And we need more of that. If philanthropy is gonna stick around for another 30, 40 years, let's bring organizers into these spaces, because what we need is people organizing not just money, but again, power, so we can keep moving forward in the right direction. I say that too because we can create those institutions that can provide the retirement funds and all the perks, right, that happen when we're in philanthropy that don't happen. Because I spent 15 years first as an organizer working in the nonprofit sector. I didn't know how the heck I was gonna pay back my loans, but I was in Washington Heights. That's what I did. That's what I was supposed to do even after I graduated. But when I got my first job at the foundation, they were like, oh, we'll pay 4 times into your retirement. I was like, what, people do that? You know, and I was able to pay off my loans just because I spent 9 years at a foundation. So how do we create more of those opportunities for people who are hustling right now to create those changes and give them those jobs?
Sure. I do know, I'm not often around CEOs and boards that really struggle with new dynamics and new cultures and what I would call improved and better dynamics and cultures in foundations. The one thing I think I've really personally benefited from, and I've really encouraged it amongst my staff, is to get very, we talk a lot about comfort with conflict, but I think there's a way to be savvy with conflict. And this is something I myself wanted to get a better knowledge of over the last couple of years. There are great minds that have thought a lot about conflict and conflict styles. And I think if you're going, the reality is foundations are typically very top heavy. They're very trustee driven. Again, I'm not often in circles with trustees that are autocratic in how they look at their work, but I hear about them, and every now and then I trip into a room where everybody in the room is dealing with an autocratic trusteeship, and I'm thinking, you know, they're trying to figure out what to do, and I'm thinking, leave. But it does require a certain amount of advocacy on your part. I mean, even as a CEO of a foundation, I did have a board prior to the one I have now, and that first board, while supportive in many ways, did have a strong hand in other ways, and it took very careful advocacy internally to move some things forward, and a lot of risk, I think, on my part at times, where I just had to assume I'm pushing the edge, and I may get thrown over the side, but I know it's for what needs to happen here. And I know that is a very difficult thing, no matter where you are in a foundation, where you rank, whatever the words are, to say to you, someone who might be just entering a foundation, go out there and fight for yourself. There is a way to do it, I think, really understanding how to utilize accommodation, avoidance, competition, collaboration type conflict styles, and really paying attention to who above you is engaging in them as well and understanding them. If you don't know what I mean when I say that, I'd encourage you to look at it, because that I've seen in my own staff use of conflict in such productive ways. One of my favorites, I wouldn't call it conflict, it's an interesting style, but the director of our grant-making practice, Gwyneth, I don't know, some of you may know Gwyneth, she's kind of a legend. She will send me articles 3-4 times a day. And it's on me to figure out what the message is that she's trying to send me. And if I don't respond at some point on Slack back to her like, that was interesting, or give her a smiley face or something, back comes, well, what did you think? Yeah. And are we doing this? Do you think we're doing this? I think we might want to consider doing this. And it's her way of just making a nice little advocacy message to me. And I know I'm being very granular here. I don't have a grand speech to give you on this, except to say that there are tools and ways to advocate, and I would encourage you to do so. Then let me just flip it really quickly over to the leaders of foundations. I fundamentally believe, and I'm a traditional white dude from a foundation. I'm the guy you would expect to see running most foundations 10 years ago. Thankfully, that's changing rapidly. I think it's really incumbent upon us at the highest levels of foundations to hire in young people of color and whatever discomfort that could bring for you, because there are viewpoints that are not yours coming into the foundation, and it will be challenging at times. You need to make the space. You need to make the space. The sector is not going to change if we have the same people running it over and over again, and the sector needs to change. We can't continue to do this the way we're doing it. We just can't. But we are. There are 135,000 private foundations in the United States. Whenever you see those, not petitions, but pledges come out where foundations are going to sign on, and it's always this beautiful moment when a group of foundations sign on to a pledge. How many are on that? 60? 100? Rounding error on how many private foundations there are in America. We have got to unlock this capital. We have got to change it. And I guess I'm old now. So as an old guy, I get to say the line, I believe in the next generation. I really do. And I have marveled at the team I have and the way the team at Stupski has engaged young people as interns, real interns that come in and really make decisions inside the foundation in our work in PSS and otherwise. And that, I hope we work very hard with that internship. We are investing as much into these interns as anything else we do, because these young women usually are the future of this sector. And we want their minds, the minds of young women of color coming into this sector and feeling empowered to challenge and push. And we hope that to you leaders out there, you'll respond in kind so that we can get to the next place.
Thank you. So we're going to give you a chance now to ask a few questions and actually talk amongst yourselves. So what I want you to do, you should have gotten cards when you got in. And what we want you to do is just have a share with your neighbor for a minute, just to ask 2 questions. Have you think about 2 questions. One is, what is your question for the panelists? The second question is, what's your bold vision for for philanthropy that you haven't heard today? Because we really want to hear that. So what's your bold vision, and what's a question that you have for the panelists? And we'll give you about 5-10 minutes to talk with your neighbor. Grab 1 or 2 people, no more than 2, because otherwise it'll take too long. So grab 1 or 2 people, talk for a few minutes, grab your questions, and your bold vision. Share your bold vision.
Okay, we're going to give you about 1 more minute. So let's get your questions down on your paper. Let's get your ideas down on your cards. We want to collect them. We know we've got some great ideas in the audience, so we want to hear about them. So if you have your cards, there are some folks passing through the lanes here to pick them up. So we're going to now just turn for a minute on a little bit of a personal journey with our panelists. And with this work that we're doing, it requires, I know for me personally, you know, they're definitely, I'm very much in the learning and unlearning phase, without question. And I'm constantly having to push myself. And I think one of the things that helps me is I'm also increasingly working to be a curious person. Well, maybe curious to other people already, but working to be curious also about other people's views, et cetera. But let me just start by just asking for a minute to each of you, to be very brief. What's something that you've had to learn or unlearn to be at this place of imagining a different world from where we are today with regards to philanthropy? And I'll start with you, Glenn.
So it's okay, you can pick on me, it happens all the time. When I started in philanthropy, it's kind of by an accident that I got in here. I was looking for a job. My wife had gotten a great one at an immigration firm here in San Francisco, very activist, cool firm, so we wanted to come out here. And I was hired by Jane Wales at the World Affairs Council to start something called the Global Philanthropy Forum. I'd heard of Global. I had a rough idea what forum was. I had no idea what philanthropy was, but eager for a job, you say, yes, I'll take it. I know everything about that. We're good. And from that point, for about 10 years, I'd say 10, 12, 14 years, I've got very deeply interested and focused on strategic philanthropy. It was an era of social entrepreneurship and microcredit. I got to the other side of that, and I was at a conference that Stanford held, the Nonprofit Management Institute, about 6 years ago, I think it was, maybe 5. And they had 4 racial justice panelists come up and speak. And they were talking about a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Yep. And they were saying things like the nonprofit industrial complex does not care about us. And I was, I'm sure, visibly shaken. I felt like, what have I been doing with my life? What have I been supporting and pushing and thinking? And to Willa's point, I felt it was time for deep unlearning. And so that would be my moment for me. I'm so grateful to them. I don't know if I will ever speak to them again. I can't remember who they were. I should go back and look at the agenda. But they rocked me. I was very embarrassed for what had happened in a good way, and immediately started questioning everything. And I unfortunately or fortunately at the time, was running a foundation. So for the people working for me, I'm sure it was pretty shocking too, because we changed a lot very quickly to where we are today, and still changing. I hope we never stop.
Janice.
I think when I think about learn and unlearn, I'll go back to my to earlier years of my career. I spent the first 20-something years in high tech at HP, And when folks would ask me what, was my long-term career goal, I would always say to start my own foundation. So here I was immersed in high tech and did every kind of P&L job known to man, but my real inner compass and my real why was to make a bigger impact. And so whether that was doing it through HP, some of the work they were doing in community, and then having an opportunity to create a new corporate social impact initiative, my why was still always, how do I make the biggest impact for my community? And what I saw on the other side of that then was to create my own foundation. I didn't know there are many, many different ways for us to make that impact and really speak to this opportunity to address system change. But I think the unlearning now is kind of what does this chapter look like for younger people? And so for any of you who have high school, college students, man, this is a very different world, especially in terms of social justice. And I say that, but I have a son who graduates next week from University of Colorado Boulder, and all right, go Buffs. That's you, huh? And then a daughter graduated from USC last year, but looking at this world and this space through their lens is a very different chapter. And I also say, I grew up here in the Bay Area. I never experienced what they've had to experience in the last 8 years as it relates to being Black in America, right? Never experienced what and some of that, some experiences here, but then as I mentioned, we moved to Dallas and what they experienced in Dallas as well. And even, what they've had to consume even just through media is a very different world. So when I think about my early days of wanting to start a foundation and then where I am now, it's kind of unlearning and kind of demything some of what I thought it was like on the other side, but it's really looking at how can I really prepare space for them to really come in and lead.
Thank you. I don't know why you leave me for last. I feel like I have to do these deep thoughts, but let me just tell you what's going through my mind right now, so bear with me. So I have learned that I've learned that too. Go ahead and just say it. I've learned to just let go of the expectations that others have put on me as a leader, as a woman, as a Dominicana, as who I am as a person. I have let go of the idea of that myth that what gets measured gets done. No, people are doing constantly in community. Let them determine what their success and their measurements look like. I have learned that joy is the outcome we all want. That joy and the freedom we talked about today to just live freely in community is an outcome worth fighting for. I learned from Cherie Tang that love can be measured, that love and leading from your heart is a worthy way of leading. I have unlearned that I need to have a logic model, a theory of change. I have unlearned that I need to have all of the resources in order to move forward and act with urgency. People are our greatest assets. And when we come around one another and we stand with one another and we learn from one another and we push forward together, like we are as a community unstoppable. The money will come. I agree, the revolutions will not be funded. It needs to be resourced. But the money should not outweigh the people, the human capital that we are to elevate and not empower. We had a side conversation. I have also learned that we don't empower no one. We are born with power and agency. Community has power and agency to create change. All we got to do is sometimes get out the way, stand beside, listen, learn together, and use all the influential pieces of power that we have, the money, the connections, the people that we know on the other side that community has never been exposed to, the donors that come to our table and say, hey, I want to do this for community. Well, have you spoken to the community and see what they want? Have you had that conversation before you start that fund that you dreamt about? Have you heard from the people? Have you sat with them? Have you gotten to know them, their dreams and their vision? I don't know if I'm answering your question, Willa, but I'm still learning and unlearning. And I've also learned that supporting leaders and their sabbaticals, their community grassroots leaders, is a worthwhile investment. That supporting the mental health of our community leaders is a worthy investment in and of itself. That power building is important, and it is an outcome that we want. It is what the NAACP wanted. It is what Cesar Chavez wanted before they were railed to just support, litigation and support programs. They wanted it to build power and give voice. It is a worthy outcome.
I'm hearing that a focus group isn't enough.
Done. And by the way, bridge span is expensive. Like, we can't afford it. Like, I've also learned, and this came, from working at the New York State Health Foundation, there is value. There is so much value. And we also need the folks who have the power and the money to also move those resources and make bridge span available to the folks who can't afford it either, too.
We want that too. Glenn, when I spoke with you, you told a story about the Threshold Foundation, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I thought it would be worth your sharing that story.
Sure. So Threshold, in this case, some of you may know of a threshold that was tied to tides. I don't know if the group is still around. Is it still around, Threshold? Tides? Yes? Okay, this is a different one. It's a small foundation up in Seattle. And such an interesting model. First of all, it's a wealthy woman who had made her money in gaming, not casino, but video, and decided she wanted to return all the money back. And so she hired 2 young women of color, one who came out of the foundation sector, one who did not. She came out of the more donor education space. And they designed, not really a foundation, they had a C3, a C4, and an LLC. And the LLC was the primary driver of this organization, and it was set up strictly to return $100,000 back to, I think it was 10 women of color who were leading organizations in the area, in the Seattle area, and also North Carolina, and just give them a check for $100,000, because let's see what happens. I think this would be a good thing. And the women who were running the organization felt that they too could have used a check for $100,000, so let's see how that would work. And that's the only money they've given out, because it was so profound what they learned. They learned that and I say this from the foundation perspective, foundations now are, in a good way, many are giving to community-based organizations in ways we haven't seen before. They're finding organizations, or organizations are finding them, and they're benefiting from, there has been, as much as I know we're critical of ourselves, and we should be, but there's been much more of a renaissance, I think, in this way, certainly in the circles I'm in. Giving money to organizations with the idea that they would immediately turn things around or immediately do the power building and all of that. What their grants, we learned very quickly, and I do hope there's some kind of measure that comes out of this that we can all think about when we make grants, that we're giving money to leaders who are living in very deprived and most likely have lived in traumatic situations. And they have not been able to take care of themselves. And these women didn't even realize it. They gave the $100,000 checks. They thought they would take it. They would do some kind of professional development. They would run off and join the Aspen Institute and go travel around learning how to be great leaders. Instead, they set up healthcare for themselves. They got the physicians they hadn't had before, financial planning help. They started thinking about their first home that they might own and how they would do that. They had some distance to make up for their own well-being. And so as I was talking to them and getting to know, I've just been enamored with this group. I started to ask them, is there some kind of quotient here? Is there something that foundations should pay in before the grant arrives? So you were referencing sabbaticals, but I wonder, how much are we undermined already by history to the degree that the people who we are most counting on to change and make the world a better place are coming from a place of trauma and deprivation to such a degree that they need to get to healthy so that they can take it from there? And is that the initial payout? It's like the pay-in that you must make as a foundation before you get to the grant. And I hope they'll say more about it. I certainly didn't do it justice, but it was very moving. I haven't stopped thinking about it since I spent time with them.
Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you. Can you speak to the tension between program officers practicing trust-based philanthropy and grant agreements that intentionally or unintentionally limit or cool grantees' efforts?
Yeah, somebody must have been listening to our conversation. So I'm going to say this. I think this is being recorded, but I'm going to say it anyway. I hate the term trust-based, and we use it right now only because in the field it is something that at least some people are speaking to. But trust-based implies that those with power didn't trust those on the ground, right? And so what we were talking about is, how are we, and maybe it's all of us in the room, going to start changing that system in and of itself? And we were saying one of the things is put the power in the community's hands to, quote unquote, critique us. Instead of us deciding who then gets the money, a very patriarchal, privileged model is, what would it look like if the community got to tell us who they want to take money from, right? So we were just saying, I think it's overused when we talk about disruption, but I do think that I'm hopeful we'll get through this chapter pretty quick right now of this term trust-based, because when we did see evidence of trust was during the pandemic, where folks were able to move money to the front line faster than we've ever seen without any reporting on the back end. Didn't need any, and we were just saying the other, privilege model is expecting someone to be resourced to give you either a 10-page proposal on the front end or a 20-page report on the back end. How do we change that system? And again, in 2020, when we moved money to the front line, we didn't ask for those proposals and we didn't ask for the reporting on the back end, but we saw more change in that period of time than ever before. So I am hopeful that there is some type of movement to even figure out how do we, quote unquote, move to something that is more centered in equity, that is community-based.
We have a question that's around how do you make the choice between whether you want to try to change the system from within the system or whether you really need to be outside the system to make the change happen?
That's a real personal question. I'm a believer you can do both at whatever season of your life you're in. I'm in philanthropy now to change it. I want a new way of doing philanthropy. I want to democratize it. I want to come in, change, disrupt it. But I know the season will come where I'm done with that and I want to go outside and be with my peeps. And by my people I mean everything that Mia was saying this morning, people who nourish and give and just who are, and become a force to continue to disrupt from the outside. So the answer really is on you to decide where you want to spend that season of your life. And at some point, I think all of us in philanthropy should take a break and go and do, what's the word when you go and you change?
Like an externship or
something to that effect. Well, go work at a nonprofit. Go raise money for a nonprofit. I think every program officer, every CEO should one day take off their jacket, their hats, whatever, and go work at a nonprofit and help them raise money. That becomes so important because we see the world the way they've been treated and seen. And then when we come back and try and disrupt more change, it may look a little different. So just putting that out there. But I think we need to do both because some of the systems that are here are not going to go away that quickly. So I mentioned reform. I'm not a big fan of economic reform or criminal reform because the systems weren't created to work for us. And so the idea of reforming an economy, no, what about building our economy, the one Manuel Pastor has been writing about, our economy, the inclusive one, where I work in it and my family, my community prospers from it. Let's rethink that. But you got to do that from the outside, not the inside. So long-winded way of saying you got to see a way of doing both. And I think that in a lifetime, there's room to do it.
I was listening to a podcast that my colleague Darren Isom did recently with Urva Shivad, who was, she passed away, but also was in her life an incredible advocate and an incredible organizer, and also an attorney and many other things. And eventually went to the Ford Foundation. She was like, I'm not the person you want to hire because it's not who I am. But one of the things that was very powerful in that was she talked about the advice she got about how to show up. And it takes me back to what you mentioned earlier, Glenn, about that notion of to make the change you want to have inside an organization that may not be aligned exactly with how you want to see things happening. It does require a certain savviness. It requires a certain way of being able to learn about how to do that in an institution. And you can learn some of those skills through advocacy, but also there are other skills that you can learn. And so it's about bringing that full package to doing that if you're going to be doing that inside and really pushing for that.
I was going to comment. I did not come from the space or the field per se of philanthropy. I've partnered with, but I think when we talk about hopefully the opportunity to move some of us around, there are some other skills that I do bring to this space. But this is my first time working within a nonprofit philanthropy organization.
I think one of the things I think you bring, Janice, is like a sense of like, let's just get it done. And
yes.
What are we waiting for? So there's not a lot of like time spent to talk, but it's like, okay, now we've talked, now let's go, which I appreciate about you. Glenn, a question for you is, what have you learned, or what is a failure from which you learned since you've had a chance to move so much money into communities? So what's a failure you've had, or something you've learned?
Well, I would say, yeah, I say it all the time now, more than ever. If I could have only started at the foundation knowing what I know today. And I think in some ways, it is that we came out of the gate, and very much under my leadership, with an idea that we could hypothesize and hypothesis test our way to change. And it was partly the pressure we felt being a spend down foundation, because we knew we would have a short runway, and we wanted to, there was this expectation that we would do, I think it was all over our website at the time, something big. We'd make big bets. Everyone was talking about big bets. I didn't really like that phrase, but people said it all the time. And so we were going to almost put on some kind of a scientific laboratory inside our own little shop to come up with the magical answers that we're then going to invest really paltry money at the end of the day against trillion-dollar problems. We're going to move like 20 million. We're going to change the world. That's our brains and foundations. It's so silly, crazy stuff. But that's where we were. And I'd say I got to a place where to me, it was failing because I felt we're not in strong relationship with community. We weren't positioned to take in the perspectives of the people most affected by our decisions. And we were ultimately, we were going to point and fire. And I felt like that was I guess I would say that felt kind of like a failure. It's a heavy word, failure in that case. I hope no one is here that was with me at that time. It didn't feel, I really loved working with you. But it did. And now I feel like with none of that, we don't have really any, I feel most uncomfortable when people use words like evaluation and assessment. I would rather we think more about how much we contribute than how much we attribute. I feel uncomfortable when a staff member seems really concerned about whether they have metrics or not. I wish they would just take a breath and let them go. But we have a very autonomous team, so I don't force them not to have metrics, but I ask questions like, why do you have metrics? So I feel that was a lot learned, and I have no idea how we're going to figure out whether any of it's working now. I don't really care. I just really appreciate that we're moving the money, and I've learned from the time where we were much more controlling and restrictive.
And when we talked, you shared that, how do I really know it's working anyway? How do I really see the change that's happening anyway and really know that we did it?
Well, and that's what Mia said, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was great. Like, I'm working on this thing, I'll be dead when it happens. So, well, that's literally our foundation. Our foundation will be gone, probably, whatever happens. even for those that must live forever foundations, which I really think is a psychological condition that donors need to think about, and people who work at these foundations. The thought that you are so good at what you're doing today, you're going to need to be around later for future problems. Like, look in the mirror, man, the problems are really bad, and you're not doing much about them now, so why do we need you later? But the fact that you're thinking that way, you know, I think, just think about the fact that you're never really gonna know. And that's probably a good thing. And give that way. And yeah, that was important for us to learn.
So this individual gave a title to their question: Empty Promises. A number of pledges were made following George Floyd's murder, and many were not fulfilled. Philanthropy's made many empty promises, but how do we hold institutions in the sector accountable? That's a very tough question.
Well, it ain't going to be the IRS, I'll tell you that. So
Yeah, what did you say?
I said it's not going to be the IRS to hold us accountable. So.
I mean, it's not that it's a tough question. It's, again, going back to power. Like, foundations should be held accountable to the communities who've been stripped of the resources that belong to them because they've not been paying taxes. That's who we're accountable to. So where do we give them the platform to hold and measure our, and I'm going to say us, the philanthropic sector, how good of job we're doing?
Right.
It's not a direct, it's an easy question if we were really trying to flip the power dynamics, because really the money doesn't belong to these institutions, it belongs to the people, because those were tax dollars that were supposed to be reinvested back into their community to begin with. And so we've deprived those resources from those communities because some wealthy corporations wanted to set aside and control those assets. They haven't been paying taxes on them. So government can step in and set up. It's imagining what doesn't exist. It's what Mia's challenging us to. If we really did this right, then community, the people who the money belongs to, all those tax dollars that were stripped from schools and stripped from roads and stripped from things that have deprived people from living their most prosperous life, if we ask them to hold us accountable, then I think we'd be going somewhere.
Yeah.
And I don't know how or what that looks like, but I know that is part of the answer.
And I know there are foundations that are, you know, obviously committing to really be transparent, to actually try to begin to hold themselves accountable, and to be public about what they're doing and how they're going about it.
Yeah.
And so transparency is one part that helps.
Yeah,
it's not enough.
We should call each other out too.
Yeah.
I think
I'm a fan of that.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think, to your point, in terms of the accountability, it's on the foundation side, but it's also on the corporate side. And I think that's where there are tactful ways. If you even think about, they were talking in the first session about Roe versus Wade and how that came. That wasn't a 1-2 year, that was a 50-year game, right? And so, you know, you think about, we're in this moment right now, and if we could be as concerted and consolidated and collaborative on the left, right, and holding folks accountable, just imagine what would be possible.
Yeah.
But I do think transparency and speaking, you know, bringing truth to power is an important aspect of it.
Can I just say a couple quick things? I really feel this is, going back to my initial comments, this is the result of growing out of the finance sector. The only watchdog on us is supposedly the IRS. There's no Department of Philanthropy, there's no State Department of Philanthropy, and there should be. And the thing that we forget is, I'll speak mostly as a family foundation representative, these dollars are public dollars that we are stewarding. I don't know if people think about that. Donors, when you sit in a room with them, will say, it's my money after all. It's not their money. They gave their money to a private foundation that should be, in my view, governed by community leaders. There's your first level of accountability. What happens in family foundations is that they become centered on what the donor wants. They become centered on what the family wants. And usually they become centered on what the family's issues are, so they can use the foundation to help each other love each other more. These are all backwards things. This accountability could be easy. The problem is there are organizations out there, I'll let you find them online, who are fighting tooth and nail against any regulation of this for the donors. So I really do believe we are in need of something very important because it's not going to happen unless we get it. And it is policy, laws and rules and standards, because this is taxpayer money we're stewarding. It is not personal party money.
That's right.
All right, good question. So I'm going to now turn it to our panelists and ask you each to share one final quick observation or word of advice for the audience. And I'm going to start with Jacqueline.
Just liberate the capital. Liberate the capital, invest in the people, forget about your programs and your logic models and all that. Invest in people and liberate those resources that belong to them to begin with.
Janice.
Yeah, my parting comment to all of you is let's go. I had the opportunity to come back here to the Bay Area, and what I will tell you is that's what we do in the Bay Area. We get it done, right? And I've had a chance to be involved in national and global work in this space, but I will say there's a power and there's a strength from the Bay Area that is like no other. So I'm hopeful when we all leave Northern California grant makers today that we will all figure out what is that collective power that we can move some things forward.
Thank you so much. It was great to spend time with both of you. You've said it all, so thank you.
All right, well, I want to thank this group of folks. I knew this was going to be an incredible conversation and a challenging conversation, and you've delivered that, so thank you. So I want to thank Glenn, I want to thank you, Jacqueline, and thank you, Janice, for this conversation. I've loved hearing from each of you and appreciated all the questions from the audience as well. And I want to thank NCG for pushing our thinking with the 5 shifts, because that definitely is a document that really, I think, has helped us to say, what are some things we need to be doing right now in philanthropy and that we can do? And also providing the space today and the other conversation that happened earlier, and I'm sure the conversations this afternoon, where we'll really be imagining what can we be doing in philanthropy differently and how do we show up for that? And also be in the space of courage and learning and also being open to welcoming a variety of perspectives as we do our work as well, from all sides, because at the end of the day, we live in one country, and we eventually have to figure out how to make it work. So thank you all.
Thank you, Willa.
Thank you.